Now Todd Simmons from New York University will present the paper Dr. Levick and his hooligan penguins. Todd Simmons achieved his master's degree in the spring 2020 as a member of the New York University's inaugural class in the Animal Studies program through the Environmental Studies Department. He is currently working on a second master's degree in New York University's History Department, focusing on public history. And prior to this, his studies were focused, he was working as a documentary photographer, journalist, and academic book reviewers. So please, Todd.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful conference. One of the benefits of presenting on the last day is you hear wonderful work that all of a sudden gives you new ideas and changes things. And so things have changed. I will be talking about Dr. Levick and his penguins, but other instances of boredom arose after some comments on the first day. Kind of to set up where I'm working from animal studies and history, I'll just begin in 1984, Robert Delort wrote Les Animaux ont une histoire. Badly butchering that. In this book, he created a new type of history that has been developed by contemporary French thinkers such as Éric Berthet, Michel Pastoureau, and Dominique Listel, among others. Reimagining stories through careful reading of the archive is what these thinkers have set out to do, to give animals agency through history, to dehumanize certain tools of the humanities in a sense. Robert Delort began the field of writing animal history by distinguishing the idea of zoo history as separate from the history of zoology, not by downplaying science, but showing its limits towards creating an understanding of the animal life of the planet by examining the lives of 9 different species, detailing how historians can read between the lines of archival sources and discern animal behaviors much as an ethologist would do, but through the lens of animal agency. Animal history, though, is still tied into anthropocentric ways of thinking. Éric Berthet writes that in the past 30 years, animals still have very little place as real beings. We must look more closely, he says, at the influence of animals and their relationships with humans as their role as actual actors in light of ethology's growing insistence, at least for certain species and an increasing number of them, on the behavior of each animal as actor, individual, and even person, on the cognitive capacities of animal individuals, and on the sociability and cultures of animal groups, thus revealing the inadequacies of purely human approaches. We must leave the human side, moving to the animal side in order to better understand human-animal relationships, but also in order to better know these living actor beings who deserve to be studied in and of themselves. This means that the definition of history must be broadened, abandoning the too restricted definition of a science of humans in time, in which many historians have become entrenched. This is what I'm attempting to do in my work. Animal boredom has been explored in the context of domesticated animals. For example, bored horses crib in their stalls, circle their stalls, bang their heads on walls, pull nearby objects into the stalls. And likewise, there's a growing literature on the boredom of animals kept in captivity. The 1980s saw a large growth in that towards zookeepers in the literature. 2 years ago, I was at the Bronx Zoo and observed a bored gorilla masturbating in front of a Midwestern family. They were concerned that the gorilla had lice that could somehow get out of the glass enclosure and walked away scratching themselves. I was kind of scratching my head that nobody really seemed to recognize what the behavior was. In the late 1800s, ennui was a term that most often applied to people of a certain class and position, particularly young women, in tracts that called for increased educational opportunities for them. But the first reference to kind of zoo behavior of boredom was an 1891 book called Animal Sketches by C. Lloyd Morgan. And it applies the term boredom to baboons who were yawning in their cages. We've discovered that this yawning behavior is more a sign of aggression rather than boredom. But he followed up with a second book in 1909 that described the role of play in alleviating the boredom of animals that are kept in their cages. But we don't consider wild animal boredom as closely. The struggle for survival, particularly in the modern world, would seem to be overwhelming. In 2012, a previously unpublished 4-page pamphlet, of which 100 copies were printed in 1915 by Dr. George Murray Levick, described and entitled "The Sexual Habits of the Adelaide Penguin," was discovered at the Natural History Museum at Tring. This pamphlet was based on Levick's personal field observation at Cape Adare during the British Antarctic expedition of 1910 and examined in detail the sexual activity, autoerotic behavior, and what he referred to as the aberrant behavior of unpaired males, both young as well as older widowed males and females. In this pamphlet, he documented accounts of necrophilia, sexual coercion, sexual and physical abuse of chicks, non-procreative sex, and homosexual behavior. Levick did, however, publish 2 accounts of the Adelaide penguin, one for popular audiences and the other for the scientific community. In the introductory paper that published this pamphlet, which had not been seen for almost a century, authors Douglas Russell, William Sladen, and David Ainley wrote that Levick's account made repeated, ill-defined reference to the behavior of non-breeding wanderers, young inexperienced breeders, and experienced unpaired males, under the nebulous term of hooligan cocks. Levick writes in his popular account, many of the colonies, especially those nearer the water, are plagued by little knots of hooligans who hang about their outskirts, and should a chick go astray, it stands a good chance of losing its life at their hands. The crimes which they commit are such as to find no place in this book, but it is interesting indeed to note that when nature intends them to find employment, these birds, like men, degenerate into idleness. Levick was appalled at the behavior of these hooligan penguins, so much so that he used coded language in his notebooks when documenting these behaviors, using the Greek alphabet in certain instances when making his annotations. In 2020, the Terra Nova expedition notebooks that he wrote were acquired by the Natural History Museum of London. A hooligan, I think, is not a nebulous term, but rather something very specific. If we look at it in terms of modern use of the word hooligan, Eric Dunning in the book Fighting Fans, Football Hooliganism as a World Phenomenon writes that the macro-sociological accounts suggest that structural strains, experiences of deprivation, or low social economic background can at times be instrumental to the acceptance and reproduction of norms that tolerate great levels of violence and territoriality, which is a common feature of football hooliganism. Furthermore, social cleavages within societies facilitate the development of strong in-group bonds and intense feelings of antagonism towards outsiders, which in turn can facilitate group identification and affect the likelihood of fan violence. The link between boredom and hooliganism seemed to shatter after Bill Buford's book Among the Thugs was criticized for its pop psychology. But the concept of boredom and hooliganism is still tied in a 2016 paper entitled Alcohol and Violent Behavior Among Football Spectators, which notes that the boredom minimization argument can be linked to alcohol consumption creating violence in the fans. As they say, following the seek for boredom minimization argument, alcohol intake would suit the context for its property to increase powerful feelings in which might motivate the thrill quest for excitement and also reduce one's concern for public sanctions and a sense of danger. Sebastian Junger, in his book about war, talks about and references many times the boredom of soldiers who are waiting on the battlefield between firefights. But maybe I'm moving too far into the modern and ignoring the historic context that I was talking about. The word hooligan first appeared in reference to a gang in Lambeth, London in 1894, but was popularized by Clarence Rook in his 1899 book, Hooligan Nights, which is billed as being the life and opinions of a young, unrepentant criminal recounted by himself. In this book, Rook is looking at something opposite of boredom when he examines the life of Alf. He says that he does not know what it is to be bored. Every day has its interests and every day has its possibility of the unexpected, which is just what the steady, honest worker misses. But the word almost immediately began to change. By 1903, rather than characterizing hooligans as possessing criminal industriousness, it began to stereotype the lazy, bored young man who would rather make easy money through violence than work hard for it. In fact, so much was the hooligan despised that attached to the miscellanea of the Mendel Journal for the year, 2 years just prior to Levick's departure for the expedition was this. And I quote, "As soon as a hooligan or other criminal is arrested for some felony or misdemeanor, or an unemployable seeks the shelter of the workhouse, the nation has the right to say, in the light of modern knowledge which endorses some of the conceptions of Plato, we know that the committal of crime or perennial laziness is in many instances, perhaps in most, a manifestation of congenital civic defectiveness. We therefore want to know your history. We shall construct your pedigree, and if we find that your race is unworthy, you and all its afflicted members shall lose your ordinary civic liberties, and for you and your race there shall be no further opportunity of propagation." These are kind of strong words for what hooligans were, and at that point it had become kind of bored and lazy youths. I think of some. I started thinking of some of the phrases that I heard during the first day of the conference, and Wyman Tilburg's comments about religion were interesting, although they didn't apply to penguins, except in the term of maybe Anatole France's book Penguin Island. There were a lot of other phrases that caught my ear. Unmarried men, anger, frustration, sadness, occurring as correlates. People talked about restlessness, being unchallenged, group meaning, seeking stimulation, humans as animals, desire binds, and the pain of unused powers, which would seem to apply to these penguins that were not mating. There was something that Dr. Eastwood spoke of first and second order consciousness that made me think about insects. I had mentioned in my abstract that I was going to look at other animal boredom, and this caused kind of a reanalysis of where I started. So all of this is kind of new and worked because if we indeed recognize humans as animals, as part of nature, then continuing the study of references to boredom in the historic archive bear fruit. While many are reluctant to ascribe human emotions to animals and the concern that we are being anthropomorphic, what if we examine boredom as a standard to measure animal consciousness? In the search for indicators of animal consciousness, a hierarchy is erected from which consciousness seeps down from the primates, drying up far before it reaches the level of insects. But Jean-Henri Fabre, who's famous for his investigation of the lives of insects, can, like many writers, be accused of anthropomorphism, but his touch was rather light for his time period as an insect biographer. One of the examples of what he wrote is about the cicada's song, and his descriptions of it as the idea of a voice that sings for joy, going beyond Hegel's quote that the animal finds its voice in its violent death. He writes of the word boredom in relationship to the lives of captive grasshoppers and their inability to breed, and of spiders in their webs awaiting the touch of a fly on the delicate threads. If we believe that insects have subjectivity, that there is what it is to be an insect, remembering that von Uxküll used insects, or rather arachnids, as his base for the concept of Umwelt, then consciousness, which is a key driver in most discussions of animal rights and is in a sense a currency by which we judge other animals, how much or how little consciousness a species possesses, sets it in a new hierarchy that creates a different kind of teleology and exceptionalism. In the case of insects, we find not only that it is increasingly difficult to pin down whether or not they are consciousness through a comparison with the vertebrate mechanisms where we typically locate it, but we also find ourselves confronted by just what consciousness is. Andrew Barron, a neurobiologist in the Department of Biology at Macquarie University, and Colin Klein, who was in the philosophy department of the same university, wrote in kind of a cut and paste way, consciousness is marked by the presence of subjective experience. In the philosopher's term of art, there is something it is like for us to be aware of the world. If insects do not have subjective experience, why not? Attempts to deploy to animals behavioral paradigms that are considered evidence of consciousness processing when successfully performed by humans introduces a strong bias towards anthropomorphic performance by animals. We have downplayed behavioral data. Critically, we have not relied on evidence of unusual or clever achievements by insects. Rather, we suggest behavior is important only insofar as it is a guide to understanding the underlying mechanisms by which behavior is generated. Further, the bias towards clever animals is itself distorting. Many invertebrates live comparatively simple lives without complex forms of communication or social behavior. If one cares about the basic capacity for consciousness and where it came from, one should be prepared to accept that the origins of consciousness may lie in animals who do only very boring, unclever things. We propose that at least one invertebrate clade, the insects, has a capacity for the most basic aspect of consciousness, subjective experience. Invertebrates, the capacity for subjective experience is supported by integrated structures in the midbrain that create a neural simulation of the state of mobile animal in space. This integrated and egocentric representation of the world from the animal's perspective is sufficient for subjective experience. Structures in the insect brain perform analogous functions. Therefore, we argue the insect brain also supports a capacity for subjective experience. In both invertebrates and insects, this form of behavioral control system evolved as a sufficient solution to the basic problems of sensory reference and true navigation. The basic brain structures that support subjective experience, they note, invertebrates and insects are very different from each other, but in both cases are basal to each clade. So if we are granting insects subjective experience, okay, thank you. It was this paper that led animal liberationist Peter Singer to write about insects. If insects have subjective experiences, there is much more consciousness in the world than we may have thought, because there are, according to an estimate from the Smithsonian Institution, some 10 quintillion individual insects alive at any one time. If we were to think about that, how we are to think about that depends on what we believe their subjective experiences could be like. And here the comparative structures don't tell us much. In the West, we tend to smile at Jane monks who sweep ants from their paths to avoid treading on them. We should instead admire the monks for carrying compassion to its logical conclusions. This does not mean that we should launch a campaign for insect rights. We still do not know enough about insect subjective experiences to do that. And in any case, the world is far from being ready to take such a campaign seriously. But if we are seeing that insects have the subjective experience and can accept the fact that they can experience boredom, then there is not just much more consciousness in the world than we can think of, but there is much more boredom in the world than we can imagine. And I think that perhaps boredom could be one of the keys moving forward in relating to animal studies. Thank you.
Wow. We usually say that we don't know almost anything about boredom, about the experience of boredom, but what about animal boredom? Incredible. So, do you have any questions for Todd?
I have just a comment, if I may. So thanks for that fascinating talk. I don't really have a question, but I think I just want to stress. I think this understanding of boredom in animals, with all its challenges, right? Because for one, we can't ask them, not even the smartest, I mean, except for humans, of course. In order to understand the sort of basic processes that boredom may serve, especially from a potentially evolutionary perspective, I think that's where some of the key answers will come from. Not so much from human psychology, but to understand how this operates with animals. So I'm truly fascinated with this particular area of investigation and its links to consciousness and things like that. It's just to put that out there. It's not really a question. So thanks.
So more questions? I know we have an expert on animal boredom among us, but so I can say something. Well, this is a question. I spent part of my PhD training just researching on boredom before we became Homo sapiens, and how boredom makes us be human beings. So my question is, what does a creator need to be able to experience boredom?
That's kind of hard to pin down because we're still trying to pin down what a creature needs to have to experience consciousness, and that's constantly changing. There have been historically, certain indexes erected. Pain, can a creature feel pain? We look at some of the contemporary writings that say animals can experience grief. I think that some of the correlates to boredom that were discussed on the first day, I think can perhaps lead us to an understanding of animal boredom, maybe more so than what we consider correlates of other emotions or feelings such as grief or happiness. Science is very nervous about ascribing what they consider human emotions and human consciousness to animals. I think that one of the interesting things that kind of keyed off in my mind was Dr. Easterwood talking about the first order and second order consciousness. And so looking at what they're discussing about the levels of consciousness of insects kind of, for me, keyed off of the idea that perhaps it is there, and perhaps we may not recognize the correlates but it's really kind of such a hard field because there are so many ideas, and within the field itself, there are so many ways of looking at it and so many concerns about moving forward with animal activism, animal studies. A lot of animal studies turns towards activism. And that search for consciousness seems to be, kind of ever elusive. There will always be a new bar to jump. And so, but I think that once we look at work that is looking at first and second level consciousness, and we can start to look for indicators from that.
I was thinking in very particular things like, for example, a theory of other minds on something like this. Yeah, thank you.
There are a question in the comment box.
Thank you, Marius. Sorry.
About the relationship between the ideas you talked about and the panpsychism. I don't know how is the right pronunciation. Is it useful, or to the contrary, assuming that all things have consciousness is too general? This was the question.
That's that's a good question. Assuming that all things have consciousness, I don't know. it's difficult. I think that we're expanding the range of what we consider to have consciousness all the time. I think some of the work that's being done in botany with trees in terms of the connection between roots and the, I'm trying to draw this from my mind, I think it's the mycelial membranes that connect the roots of trees so that they communicate, would indicate levels of consciousness that perhaps we don't recognize. We think of trees as being rooted, and they are indeed, and plants rooted to a spot. And so we don't see, we perhaps under-realize consciousness and communication between them. And it could be that they are the most conscious beings around. Consciousness is, I think, such a difficult, I read a quote actually, when I say consciousness, they could be the most conscious creatures around. Somebody wrote recently that trees are the only creatures on earth that raise us by providing us with food, oxygen, and then feed on our decomposing bodies. So they are perhaps the highest intelligence and the highest being on the planet. But I think that consciousness, in ascribing consciousness to everything, I think we start perhaps on maybe a little bit of a slippery slope. I don't necessarily think that Peter Singer's right in saying, well, we need to find, you know, and ascribe only to what we can say primates and then work our way down through vertebrates. But I think that we need to, and what I'm trying to do is investigate the historical record to see where references to what we can consider to be consciousness lie. And what that means for the time period, whether it's a specific term like hooliganism, begin, and how people perceive consciousness. Words are always changing, and meanings are always changing. There were no scientists before a certain point in the 1800s because scientist wasn't a word. As we start to generate words, and as these words start to change and our meanings of them deepen, such as consciousness, and we can realize and recognize new consciousnesses all around us. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that we'll constantly be realizing new consciousnesses all around us, and I think that the historical record can begin to teach us ways in which to see that.
So from boring video games to animal boredom, I think this is the end of this miscellaneous panel. Thank you so very much. We have now a break of 1 hour, and we will come back at 3 p.m. with the architecture panel. Thank you so very much, and see you in a while.